Welcome back. We're in week 7, Bible in a Year, and this week we're going to get into the final words of Leviticus, transition to the book of Numbers, where we see Israel's rebellion, a transition from receiving God's law to going to the promised land, the things in between. But instead of stepping forward in this great faith, they fall into this complaining. There's rebellion, there's fear, and it all leads to devastating consequences. So as we walk through all of these passages, let's be mindful that we're going to see God's blessings and warnings. We're going to see Israel's growing resistance to move forward and a supernatural connection that goes all the way back to Genesis chapter 6. So let's dive in first to 3 highlights that we can look forward to and be mindful of as we read along. And the first one is Leviticus. As it closes out, God lays out rewards for obedience, blessings for obedience, and the consequences of disobedience or rebellion. And if Israel follows his commands, they're going to experience peace, provision, protection. But if they turn away, they're going to face exile, oppression. They're going to have suffering. And this sets the stage really for the journey we're going to be reading about ahead in the next couple of books of the Bible here. And the next highlight that we're going to cover is going into the book of Numbers here. And this book picks up right after Israel's time at Mount Sinai, and it details now this journey towards the promised land. It really is a book of transition, we can say. It moves from God's covenant laws in Leviticus to the reality of their struggles that they experience in the wilderness. In this book here, it's going to record 2 censuses that we're going to see. The first is to organize Israel's army. The second one that we'll get into is to prepare this next generation for going into Canaan. And throughout the book here, we'll see Israel's repeated rebellion. They're complaining against the hardships, against God, and the resistance of God's leadership and the people that he's put in front of them. And for the final highlight here, the third one, we're going to get into the 12 spies being sent out to the promised land. And this is the biggest test that Israel is going to have. Moses sends out 12 spies. They confirm this is the land that God truly has shown us, but most of them focus on the dangers, the massive fortified city, the descendants of the Nephilim living there. And rather than believing in God's power, fear, it overtakes all of them. It spreads into the camp. Only Joshua and Caleb remain in faith and trust God for the victory that he has already promised them. But Israel listens to the fearful report, the whole camp, the whole people, and this leads to one of the greatest failures in their history. Now let's transition to 3 powerful themes I want us to keep in mind as we read, and that will shape how we understand God's character and our faith journey. The first is obedience brings blessing, rebellion brings judgment. God's covenant is abundantly clear. Faithfulness leads to blessing, but disobedience leads to discipline. And Israel's journey is a constant back and forth, always trusting, not trusting God, and eventually turning away from him. And this same principle carries into the New Testament, the church age here, where Jesus calls us today to walk by faith, not by sight. And the next key theme here is leadership and rebellion. And one of the biggest struggles Israel is facing is accepting God's chosen leadership, a theme that ultimately will point to Christ. For Moses to Joshua, God's chosen leaders are often rejected. And Miriam and Aaron, Aaron's brother and sister, question Moses, much like how the religious leaders of Jesus' time rejected him. And God establishes his authority through Moses, just as later on he does through Christ. But at the core of their rebellion is something deeper, and that is fear. And this leads to our third key theme, faith versus fear. The spies saw the same land together, but they came back with 2 very opposite perspectives. 10 spies saw giants. They saw obstacles. They saw defeat. Caleb and Joshua saw God's promises, provision, protection, and victory. And this moment really teaches us that fear will distort your reality. When we focus on our problems instead of God's power, we miss out on what He has for us. Now, let's step for a moment into the supernatural worldview as we read through these chapters this week. We're going to encounter one that connects all the way back to Genesis. And when the spies report that they see the descendants of the Nephilim in Canaan, this is not an exaggeration. It connects back to Genesis 6, where the sons of God took human wives, produced a corrupted lineage. These beings were wiped out at the flood, but their presence still persists now in Canaan, and it's specifically among Israel's strongest enemies they're going to face. And this, mind you, is not about physical strength. It's about spiritual opposition. We need to keep that in mind. The nations of Canaan weren't just random groups. They were part of a rebellion against God's rule and the seed of the serpent out to destroy the seed of Adam, leading ultimately to Jesus. So when Israel stood at the border of their land that they were about to enter into, if they would fight for it, their battle wasn't just against human armies. It was a spiritual war as well, and part of the conflict that continues throughout Scripture. But as we'll see later on, God's power always, I repeat, always prevails, and His promises remain true despite obstacles and opposition. And this will now bring us to our closing thoughts. What can we take away from all of this today? This week's reading coming up is packed with lessons about faith, about obedience, and a trust in God's leadership. Israel's fear kept them from stepping into the promise, but Caleb and Joshua remind us that faith moves forward even when the path looks uncertain. So as you read this week, ask yourself this: am I walking in faith, or am I letting fear hold me back? If you have any questions, leave them in the comments, email me. I'd love to discuss them with you, get some answers to them. And be sure, if you would, like this video, subscribe to this channel, check out my website for more study resources. Blessings as you read, and we'll see you next week.